Today's guest is Professor Jiang. He's a prominent educator and writer. He was born in China in the 70s, but later emigrated to Toronto, Canada, where he grew up. He graduated with distinction in English literature from Yale College, but eventually returned to China, where he taught at some of the most prestigious educational institutions, where he advocated for reform and greater creativity. His later work expanded into geopolitical commentary and predictive history. His work was widely respected in the academic and journalistic world, but recently, Jiang also exploded in popularity on social media when one of his videos predicting the Iran war went viral on YouTube. In less than a month, Jiang's YouTube channel went from obscurity to 500,000 subscribers, with viewers pouring through his catalog of videos making all sorts of geopolitical predictions, such as the Trump re-election, its implications on the Russia-Ukraine war, and the eventual. With his newfound popularity, Professor Jiang hopes to expand the work of his YouTube channel, Predictive History, where he hopes to help humanity gain more control over the present by understanding its past and estimating the future. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you all today Professor Jiang, so we can discuss what the wars in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and potentially East Asia tell us about the future of human civilization. Professor, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, Professor, if you could just please explain to my audience what predictive history is and why you believe this field of study is so important to humanity.
Yeah, sure. So, if you read history books, you will see there are many divergent views out there. There's like 10,000 ways of understanding anything. And so, the idea of predictive history is let's try to systemize this. Let's try to create a system in which we can know if we're right or wrong about the way we understand history. And so my argument is that if history is done correctly, if the framework for understanding of history is correct, then we should be able to do three things. The first is we should be able to connect the past, which is to say we should be able to turn the history into a coherent narrative about how we came into being. Second, is we should be able to explain the present. Why is the world the way it is today? And the third thing is to be able to predict future events, to predict history. So if the framework for history is able to accomplish all three, then we know that we're approaching the truth. Now, the idea is that in every conception of history, there are values and assumptions embedded in that analytical model. And if we understand the values and assumptions, we can then make a prediction model based on these values and assumptions. So predictive history, it's a way for us to better understand ourselves so that we can have better control over our own lives. And it's a way to basically push history forward so that historians come to an agreement on major historical events. So that's the general gist.
So, what is it that you understood about the past and the present moment that helped you predict correctly the 12-day Iran-Israel war?
Right. So, what clued me in that the conflict would arise between the United States and Iran is that in January 2020, Donald Trump, in his first term, he ordered an assassination of General Soleimani, the Iranian de facto ambassador in the Middle East. And that was an extremely important geopolitical event. And I don't think that people really understood how important it was. Because historically, in that region, if you kill an ambassador, that's a direct provocation of war. The other side is now forced to go to war. So the classic example is when Persia invaded Greece, the mainland Greece, in 490 BCE. Thucydides, sorry, no, not Thucydides, but Herodotus writes about this in his book, The Histories. Well, the reason why Persia launched this massive invasion of the Greek mainland was because Athens and Sparta killed their ambassadors. They literally threw their ambassadors into the well. And when you do that in that world, then that's a declaration of war. So the United States basically, by killing General Soleimani, declared war on Iran. And at that point, it was just a question of timeline. When would this happen? And this got derailed because um, Trump lost to Biden in the general election. But if you were to come back to office, then you could assume that the timeline would resume and that eventually the conflict would arise. So that sort of clued me in that a war would arise. And then what I did next was okay. who are the actors pushing for war and why would a war happen? And so as I did more research, I discovered things like Christian Zionism, the AIPAC lobby in the United States. Saudi Arabia has a vested interest in making sure that Iran that there's a regime change in Iran because of the Shia Sunni conflict. So there are lots of reasons. There's lots of actors who want to see a U.S. Iran war, and if that's the case, then you can rest assured that a war will eventually erupt between the United States and Iran.
Were you surprised at all with the timeline? I think a lot of people understood, obviously, after October 7th, that this is a eventuality or a potential event that's going to take place, especially with the collapse of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. So, were you surprised at all that it happened, in June of this year, or were you expecting it maybe to take a little longer?
Um, to be honest with you, I expected the timeline to be much more extended because for what to happen, you need to prepare lots of things. You need the proper military organization. You need to have buy-in from the military, from the Pentagon. You need buy-in from different political factions. You need to lay the groundwork. And I'm so surprised by how abrupt it has been. It's happened quicker than expected. But not only that, but the timeline seems to be much more condensed. I was expecting maybe like a 2 year run up, but it's entirely possible that by next year, before the midterms, you'll have U.S. ground troops in Iran. So I'm sort of taken aback by how fast things are moving along.
I watched a video of yours recently, and you talked about how Iran's objective, in order for it to have the advantage over the United States, is to bait them into a ground war. Obviously, after the Iraq War, that's like the dumbest mistake the United States could make. But you argue that it could still happen. How and why is that the case? If that is like, it's not that, I can't imagine the US doing something against its own interests. Of course it can. But something as catastrophic as putting troops on the ground in Iran, that is very surprising to hear. So, how and why do you see that being a possibility?
Yeah. So I use game theory analysis in order to make predictions. So I'm looking at the different actors in the region: Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, Iran are the four major actors. And I'm trying to figure out how they benefit as this game progresses. So if you're the United States, then you definitely want to cement control over the Middle East for both trade purposes and for resources, right? Because Iran is basically the center of the world. If you control Iran, you control all global trade. You negate BRICS, you negate Belt and Road. Okay, you basically isolate Russia and China. So from a strategic geopolitical perspective, the United States definitely wants control of Iran. But if you're Israel and you're Saudi Arabia, you don't want to become a vassal to the American empire. You don't want to become a proxy. You don't want to lose your sovereignty, especially Israel, because the entire point of the nation of Israel is to assert Jewish sovereignty, which they believe to be the biblical right. So, in order for that to happen, the United States needs to be destroyed. The United States needs to lose a ground war against Iran. So Saudi Arabia and Israel are both heavily invested in seeing a U.S. ground invasion. And if you watch my previous videos, you will know that Saudi Arabia and Israel are politically very strong in Washington, D.C. They spend a lot of money, they spend a lot of resources, they've co-opted a lot of politicians. Um, Donald Trump has direct line to both Saudi Arabia and Israel through his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And Donald Trump has always maintained strong relations with Saudi Arabia. Like, where was his first foreign trip overseas in the second term? Saudi Arabia, right? So Saudi Arabia has a much more influence in the Trump White House than we imagine. So both Israel and Saudi Arabia want to see a ground war. Iran wants to see a ground war as well. And there are certain steps that Iran can take to slowly provoke a ground war. If Iran at any point were to close off the Strait of Hormuz, then that will compel a ground invasion in order to reopen that Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, if Iran were to close the Strait of Hormuz, that would collapse the entire global economy, right? Southeast Asia depends on the Middle East for its oil. The Middle East needs to export its oil to be economically viable. So Iran has a series of maneuvers, a series of steps to compel a ground invasion. And the last thing that I will say is the United States military has become an imperial bureaucracy. It doesn't really have strategic foresight. It doesn't really do strategic planning anymore. It's very reactive. It's very intent on maintaining its hegemony. It doesn't really look forward. And at the end of the day, let's just say the United States loses a ground war against Iran. What are the consequences? Well, the major consequences is you have these very unpleasant congressional testimonies in Washington, D.C., where the U.S. military is harangued by congressmen. That's about it. I mean, it's not a big deal if the United States loses a ground war in Iran. But you have these very powerful actors that want to compel a ground war. And that's why, using game theory, I think a ground war is more likely than it is not.
So you said that Iran wants to draw the US in for a ground war. Why would they want that? Why would they not want to avoid the war entirely and survive?
Right. Well, I mean, we have to remember that Iran is first and foremost a theocracy. They have a religious worldview. They have an eschatology. They're there for a reason. And in the Zoroastrian framework, there will be a final war between good and evil. And in the understanding of things, well, the United States definitely represents evil, and Iran represents good. So they want that final conflict. It is in their historical religious tradition to want a conflict and to triumph in the end. And that's why Persia has been one of the most brilliant civilizations in human history. I mean, they're not just going to sit back and wait it out. So that's the first thing I will say. Second thing I will say is right now, Iran is being economically strangled by the United States, right? It can't really afford to wait it out because if it waits it out, then a new generation of Iranians who have no memory of the revolution, the much younger Iranians, they will probably revolt against Iran, the Iranian theocracy. So, if you wait this out, then the United States economic strangulation of Iran will have its attendant effect. So, um, you basically need to settle this matter before the Ayatollah Khamenei dies.
So you mentioned the word eschatology. I wanted to discuss this a little later, but we might as well discuss it now. In your recent video, either you posted it like most recently or a couple of videos ago, but you talked about the convergence of these different end of times eschatological worldviews. I'll have you describe eschatology to the audience because I don't think I could do the definition justice. But if I understood you correctly, the idea is that you have these very powerful end of times beliefs for these major civilizations, and they're converging on one point. And this point of singularity is basically an all-out war, a World War III doomsday level type event that could reshape civilization, if not destroy it entirely. And everyone sort of has a vested interest in escalating to that point, of course, in a contained manner. Like you've described, Russia, their eschatological beliefs kind of view it as trying to rebirth the Roman Empire by retaking Constantinople or modern day Istanbul. That's very contained, but obviously that sort of action, even if it is narrow politically on the globe, still fits into a larger framework and can suck in other powers and create a world war. And then obviously, you talked about Jewish eschatology, et cetera, et cetera. Could you briefly elaborate on that to tie that point into what we're discussing now, how Iran, in the Zoroastrian framework, as you described, wants to bait the United States in and potentially escalate to a major war?
Right. So eschatology. Eschatology comes from the Greek eschaton, which means the end. So eschatology literally means the study of the end times, of how the world ends. Eschatology is more commonly used as to mean the understanding of how the world might end. And most people understand eschatology as prophecy. They're trying to see how the world might end, what events might compel the end times. But if you see eschatology, how it's implemented in real life, it's more like an action plan. It's more like a strategic plan on how different religious groups can create the outcome that they want for their different religious faction. And so, what I argue in my videos is that eschatology is a prime mover of geopolitics. Now, a lot of people will say that's incorrect. It's empire that uses eschatology in order to advance its own material interests. But I disagree. I think it's reversed. I think that empires come about in order to achieve certain eschatologies. And that was true for the British Empire, and that's also true for the American Empire. The British Empire has something called the Christian Zionist eschatology, which is trying to provoke the second coming of Jesus. So different traditions, different nations have their different eschatologies. And so what this is important is when you have an eschatology, you're motivated to act geopolitically. If you don't have an eschatology, like for example, China does not have eschatology. So for thousands of years, China has basically been content to stay within its borders and not interfere geopolitically. China has absolutely no geopolitical strategy. Is not interested in the world except maybe trading with the world. But if it doesn't trade with the world, it doesn't really care either. So eschatology is important because it drives geopolitics. And what I argue is that if you look at the different eschatological traditions, there are certain points in which they all agree, in which their eschatology converge, which means that they're working towards similar goals. And you have different powerful groups in Russia, in the United States, in Britain, in Israel, in Iran, all working towards the same goal, the same geopolitical framework. Then chances are that it will be achieved at a certain point. And one of these major convergence points is a massive world war in both the Middle East and Anatolia, where Turkey is based. And so that really, according to these eschatologies, will become the framework, the basis for World War III, Anatolia and the Middle East.
So when you say they'll agree, are you referring to, just using this as an example? Let's say the Jews believe that the Messiah will return, but the Muslims or Christians may look at this Messiah and say that's the Antichrist. So we
That's
agree with you that you think that that's the Messiah, but we call that the Antichrist. And now we're all, even though we disagree on the specifics, we're all on the same page that we've
right.
reached the end.
Right. So let me give you a cynical example, right? Look at the lines between the Jews, the extreme Jews in Israel, okay? And again, this is not the majority of people. Uh, by definition, people who believe in eschatologies are religious fanatics, okay? So this isn't like maybe 1%, but because they're the ones who are most motivated, the most energetic, they're the ones who are pushing the societies forward to the detriment, obviously. Okay, so let's look at the example between Judaic eschatology and Christian Zionist eschatology. They both agree that when Israel is most threatened in the war of Gog and Magog, when the world is about to destroy Israel, Jesus will return. That the Messiah will come. Okay, in the Jewish eschatology, the Messiah will enslave the Christians. In the Christian Zionist eschatology, Jesus will return and kill a third of the Jews and convert a third of the Jews. So it's very cynical, but because, like, if you think about it, this means that they're bitter enemies, but they're working towards the same goal, which is the end times, because they believe that if the war of Gog and Magog happens, the Antichrist comes, then their Messiah, and the Messiah could be anyone. It could be Jesus, it could be someone else, but the Messiah will come, and this will signal the coming of heaven onto earth and the beginning of the Messianic age.
It's a bit of an unholy alliance.
It is a really unholy alliance, yes.
I'll send you a video that I made after we're done here. One of the motivations for October 7th, according to Abu Ubaidah, who's the spokesperson for Hamas, he said that when the Jews imported the 5 red heifers, they
Yeah.
considered this as an escalation because they see this as a precursor to destroying the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque so that they can rebuild the third temple. And so it's not the only reason. Obviously, there's the occupation, all these different things, but it was one of the reasons for them to preemptively carry out the October 7th attack, which has basically created the last 2 years of chaos in the Middle East.
Yeah, I saw the video, by the way. It was a great video. The amount of research you did on it was just incredible. Yeah. So I saw the video, and yeah, I mean, if you bring in the red heifers, then like you can basically assume that at a certain point they will destroy the Al Aqsa Mosque. How they will do so, we don't know. I mean, but I assume there are secret plans in motion to accomplish this so that they can build a third temple.
So I want to pivot now to talk to you about this concept of strategic sequencing. So you mentioned earlier how the United States empire now is like an imperial bureaucracy, that it's reacting. Um, it seems like, the Pentagon still has plans, but these plans are disrupted maybe by internal forces that have conflicting interests, especially if they've been bribed or blackmailed by Saudi Arabia or Israel or any other force. Um, so there's this concept called strategic sequencing, and I'm going to be doing a video about this. It's actually my next video that I'm going to produce, and it's been gaining a lot of attention recently. So there's this man named A. Wes Mitchell. He was appointed the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs during Trump's first term. So I think he preceded Victoria Nuland, and he played a key role in shaping the U.S. strategy toward Russia and Ukraine in the lead up to the 2022 war. His core argument is that the U.S. must strategically sequence conflicts with its major adversaries, Russia, Iran, and China, to improve the odds of winning. The ultimate goal is to confront China, given its overwhelming economic and industrial power. But Mitchell believes that this sequencing is failing. The U.S. is bogged down in Ukraine and unable to pivot fully toward Iran or China. If this continues, the risk of a larger multi-front war, possibly even World War III, increases. And if that happens, the U.S. would have to face all three adversaries simultaneously, drastically reducing its chances of victory. In short, according to Mitchell, if the U.S. doesn't win or at least freeze the Ukraine proxy war soon, it won't be able to pivot and will likely be forced to escalate and fight everyone at once. So my question to you is, do you believe the Russia-Ukraine war and the Iran war are related in any way? And is China part of the equation?
So I did read the strategic sequencing article in the Washington Post. And so I think that the problem with the American military, with Washington, D.C., with the empire, as we discussed previously, is it's become a bureaucracy. And so it doesn't have the flexibility, the vision, the planning necessary in order to switch directions. All right. So let me elaborate on this. Currently, the U.S. military doctrine is shock and awe, and the idea, and this was developed in 2003 during the Iraq War. And so, what the idea of shock and awe is we're going to throw away conventional warfare. We're not going to mass troops. We're not going to care about logistics. We're not going to get popular support. We're going to focus on precision bombing, guided by special troops. We're going to use proxies, and we're going to use target assassinations and economic warfare. Okay, so that's the idea of shock and awe, and this has worked extremely well in Iraq and Libya and Syria. And because of its success, unfortunately, the American military is now wedded to the idea of shock and awe. The problem, though, is that shock and awe is useless against a conventional army like Russia, Iran, and China. And we know because of what's happening in Ukraine. Right now, the Ukrainian military, for the past 2-3 years, they've been using shock and awe strategy, right? Precision bombing, like targeting bridges in Crimea. They've been going on the offensive, and they've been using a lot of economic warfare. Okay, that's the entire shock and awe military doctrine of the United States, and it's failed miserably in Ukraine. I mean, the death toll among Ukrainian soldiers is just incredible, and wave after wave against Russian defenses has failed, and they refuse to adapt to the battlefield tactics of the Russians. Whereas the Russians have been really nimble and flexible in adapting its strategies against the Ukrainians. So we can see exactly what would happen if the US, if NATO were to go on the field against the Russians. The NATO and the United States would use shock and awe, thinking like, oh, if we just hit them hard, they'll collapse like a house of cards, just like Iraq, just like Libya, just like Syria. So the United States has lots of capacity to fight a conventional warfare, and so that's why we're seeing this complete mess in Ukraine. Okay, so that's the U.S. side. So the strategic sequencing makes sense, but the United States military doesn't have the flexibility to adopt new strategies against its adversaries. Next thing I want to talk about is, why is this war in Ukraine happening? Now, the conventional wisdom is that Putin is worried about NATO expansionism, and that's why he attacked Ukraine. Others say, well, it's because of what the atrocities that's been happening in Donbass since 2014. You have these Russian speakers who have been. Like it's almost like ethnic cleansing. What's been happening in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, and Putin felt compelled to help his people. I think the real reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is he saw an opportunity to destroy once and for all the American empire. He saw the American empire was overextended, it was weak, it was confused, it has no political leadership, it has no vision for the future. Now's the time to strike. And so there's no way that Putin would ever agree to a peace deal to Ukraine, because the idea of strategic sequencing is let's pause this war in Ukraine, go after Iran, then go after China, then come circle back and then go after Putin. Okay, that's the idea of strategic sequencing. It doesn't say it aloud, but that's the plan. So why would Putin ever agree to say let's pause the warfare in Ukraine so the Americans can focus on Iran and then focus on China, right? And then we'll wait for us to well, then we'll wait our turn. No, for Putin, it has to be he has to overextend the American empire. So what's going to happen is Putin's going to keep on fighting in Ukraine. There's no way a peace deal will ever happen. I think Putin's long-term target, is Odessa, because if he attacks Odessa, then NATO will be compelled to come in to defend Odessa. Also, what we'll see is Russia will shore up Iran. I think that Iran has shown tremendous strategic restraint, right? The Israelis, the Americans keep on attacking Iran, but the response from Iran has been really tepid. I think Iran is being influenced by Putin and the Russians. Putin is setting things up so that when the time is appropriate, then Iran and Russia will strike, and at that point, America will be too off balance to be able to fight back. Okay, so I think Putin has this grand vision of what World War III looks like, which involves Iran and Russia. And this fits into Orthodox and Muslim and Christian eschatology because, again, World War III is what? Anatolia and the Middle East, right? So Anatolia, what's north of Anatolia? The Black Sea. And what's north of the Black Sea? Odessa. Okay, so it's this entire region which will become World War III.
So this is interesting. My understanding is that every simulation of a conventional war between NATO and Russia leads to nuclear war. Every single simulation that every war game the Pentagon has done, at the end of it, at some point, it escalates to nuclear war because one side feels compelled to either equalize the situation or finish it off entirely.
Right.
So very scary. But I agree with you. I think that the target is Odessa in order to landlock Ukraine and gut it,
Absolutely.
because you won't be able to occupy and keep it completely. But if you can just landlock it, then it's a rump state forever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let me give you a simulation where there's no nuclear war. Okay, the simulation is this: Russia encircles Odessa. NATO is forced to protect Odessa and resupply Odessa, and the Russians, they don't go all in. It's a very light siege, but NATO is drawn in. They send in troops. This forces political upheaval in Europe, right? Because the British, the French, the Germans, the Romanians, the Polish, everyone in NATO is like, why are we doing this? What stake do we have in Odessa? Let the Ukrainians, let the Americans solve this. And if you look at the political situation in Europe right now, it's extremely fragile. You know, all this immigration, economic collapse, like there are multiple factors. So Europe is now like ripe for civil war. And so, if Putin is able to lay siege to Odessa, compel NATO to invest resources, which would be politically disadvantageous back at home, then this would create political upheaval. And then you have new governments coming into place that would be more pro Russian. They would want a rapprochement with Russia because, listen, before this war, Europe and Russia were getting along great. Russia was providing cheap gas to Germany, which fueled the German economy. which increase standard of livings for Europeans. Europeans are addicted to cheap Russian oil. So there's a lot of people who want to go back to the state of affairs before 2014. So I think that's one scenario that would avoid a nuclear war. And I think that's a scenario that Putin wants.
Very interesting idea. I want to ask you now. Earlier, we talked before this interview about how you believe China and the US will have a rapprochement because they view each other as necessary for each other's economy. The US needs to consume, China needs to produce. It's a symbiotic relationship. But in the same way that you talked about how Russia understands that we can't make peace with Ukraine and give the US a chance to pause because their objective is to strategically sequence Iran, China, then come back to Russia. Does China not understand that the US views them as the near peer competitor and will ultimately want to destroy them? Thucydides is our dilemma, right? The US sees this rising empire and either destroys it or allows itself to be surpassed by it. So, in your argument, how and why would China view it as part of their interests to continue to feed the U.S. empire and have this economic relationship with them?
Great question. Okay. Yeah. So 1997, Alexander Dugin, who is the foremost geopolitical geostrategist in Russia, he's basically Putin's brain. He has this master plan for how Russia can conquer the Eurasian continent. Okay. He wrote this book called Foundations of Geopolitics. And in the book, he lays out how Russia has to build alliances with Germany, with Japan, with Iran. And he lists three major enemies of the Russian plan for global dominance, right? You have the Anglo-American Empire, which is a dominant empire. Then you have the Turks, Turkey, and then you have China. So why is it that in Dugin's perception, China is the enemy? Well, there are three reasons. Okay, the first reason is that whoever controls the Eurasian continent controls trade, right? That's the entire point of creating this mass coalition, mass confederation in Eurasia to facilitate land-based trade as opposed to sea-based trade, because the Anglo-American Empire controls sea-based trade. So if you're able to create land-based trade through railways, then you negate the Anglo-American Empire. You basically starve the American Empire to death. But then the question then is, who controls this trade network, right? Does Russia wants to control it, but so does China. So geopolitically, these are competitors. That's the first problem. Second problem is that as the Chinese economy grows, as the population grows, China needs more space. It needs more resources. China is now forced to expand out into Central Asia, right? Kazakhstan, for example. That's the traditional Russian sphere of influence, right? So in terms of resources, China needs to go into Central Asia, which forces them into direct conflict with the Russians. And Kazakhstan is a really interesting case study because for about 20, 30 years, China invested billions of dollars into Kazakhstan in order to co-opt the local elite. Then the Russians backed another political faction, which overthrew that political elite. And so all that resources that China invested in Kazakhstan has been negated. Okay, so that's the second reason why. The third reason, this is the most important reason, is this. You think about the economy of China. It is based entirely on cheap labor, right? So if China wants to export its cheap labor, where can it export it to? Not Russia, because Russia also has resources, energy, right? I mean, so the only place where China can export its cheap labor to is America, which wants cheap labor. So economically, the United States and China have a much more symbiotic relationship than China and Russia. Russia can give China cheap gas, but then what does China do with the cheap gas, right? China still needs to export that cheap labor somewhere. I mean, like it's saying Saudi Arabia. Is Saudi Arabia better off with Russia or with the United States? Obviously, the United States, because Russia doesn't need cheap oil from Saudi Arabia, right? So you can think of cheap labor as the equivalent of cheap oil, and that's why in Alexander Dugin's formulation, China and Russia are geopolitical enemies. In fact, China has much more to fear from Russia than the United States. And so as Putin, as Russia rises in global dominance, China is now sort of compelled to pivot back to the United States. Okay, so that's the grand um, idea, right? Because everyone's saying that Putin is a junior partner to China. Putin doesn't think so. Russia doesn't think so.
Yeah, very interesting. So you kind of touched on, control of uh, Central Asia, control of world trade. So this kind of ties into Mackinder's theory
That's
of the
right.
world island, right?
That's right.
What I think is both Russia and China could potentially achieve their goals without competition, but collaboration. And so, if China needs those resources and Russia needs access to greater trade, then if they form some sort of alliance, and right now they're not officially allies, but they essentially operate as such, um, they just Russia and China alone cover like the majority of the world island. It's like without even firing a single bullet, they've inched towards this victory, according to to Mackinder, who he who controls the world island controls the world essentially. And so I think it's an interesting possibility. But in your mind, is there the potential for Russia and China to achieve their goals by simply collaborating together?
That's a great point. Okay. And so what Alexander Dugin will say is this: what underpins all society is the religious worldview. And if you think about it, okay, why Russia can sort of unite the Eurasian continent is that the Orthodox worldview aligns with the Muslim worldview and aligns with the Catholic worldview. Okay, he sees these three major religious traditions as very similar in that they are very anti-materialistic, and that they're collectivists, and that they are based on faith. Okay, the problem with this is that China is an atheist country, and it's always been an atheist country. So the Chinese people are extremely materialistic people, and that's why they're always looking to the United States. Okay, the country that Chinese admire most in the world is the United States. So in terms of religion, okay, if you split the world up in terms of, in religious framework, China and the United States go well together. Where and then everyone else, the Orthodox, the Muslim, the Catholic societies go well together as well, and that's Dugin's understanding of geopolitics. Geopolitics has to be framed by religion. What drives people is religion, not economic interests. If it was purely economic interest, the world would be at peace right now.
Very interesting. Let me ask you this, if I can. How does artificial intelligence play into all of this? You talked about the export of cheap labor. Um, my understanding is that AI will produce not just automated software, but eventually automation through hardware, right? Machine robots performing a lot of this labor. And so, for example, when people critique China and they say, "Oh, look at the aging population. You have fewer young people coming in. How can they work the economy and care for the elderly at the same time? This is impossible." Well, in my mind, I always think you have AI and automation coming in that can alleviate and offset some of that reduction in demographics that can't handle labor. Well, now that labor is automated. So that's just one example of how automation and AI could either hurt or help a civilization, a society, and its economy. Um, how does AI factor into this equation?
Okay, sure. So a few years ago, 2022, I believe, Beijing hosted the Winter Olympics, and it became a national showcase of China's AI technology. So what's happening was that at restaurants, you have these drones and robots delivering food to customers and to athletes. What people don't talk about is that behind every drone were two Chinese workers, making sure the drones were operating effectively. Another way of saying this is that the Chinese cultural framework, Chinese politics, Chinese economy is based entirely on cheap labor. These things are intertwined together. And so, if China were to move towards AI, even if it were feasible, like I actually don't think it's feasible, but even if it were feasible, it would cause tremendous political, economic, social disruption in China because you have these millions and millions of unemployed workers. Where do they go? Right? The entire basis of the Communist Party is jobs for everyone. Okay, maybe these jobs suck. Maybe they don't pay very well, but at least you have a job. Okay, so basically the idea of the iron rice bowl. So that's the basis of the Communist Party legitimacy, which is basically the basis of all Chinese empires. Basically, making sure people get fed. So AI would involve just a tremendous overhaul of Chinese cultural values and assumptions that I don't believe is possible. That's the first thing. Second thing is, if you look at AI and you look at the technology, it is extremely environmentally destructive. Why is that Google, Amazon build their data centers near lakes? Because it consumes so much water and so much electricity. China does not have resources. China's been poor because of its limited resources. China imports one third of its food from the rest of the world. So the idea that China is going to invest all these environmental resources in developing AI, it's going to cause tremendous environmental strain on on the environment. Okay, and the third problem, and this is the most important problem, is if you look at history. Okay, that's why predictive history is so important. If you look at history, whenever you have monopolies, okay, and the AI is a monopoly, right? Because it's monopolies like that do AI in these different nations, right? You have rent-seeking behavior, which basically means that the people in these monopolies, they're not invested in creating this cutting-edge technology that transforms the world for the better. They're just interested in being pleased and doing this Wizard of Oz nonsense that tricks people into believing that this technology is useful when it's not. It's just not. Like you cannot find an AI company that is profitable. OpenAI, ChatGPT, they lose money on every subscriber. Okay, so this is like one of the big open secrets about artificial intelligence. This it's not profitable, and the technology is not transformative in the way that we think it is. But it is environmentally destructive. It is socially destructive, and the people in it are like priests. You know, they're like if you just listen to Sam Altman, it's just complete BS what he says. The guy clearly has no technology background. He's not an engineer by training. He like the guy's a salesman by training.
So, if that's the case, if it isn't very profitable, why are we seeing so much investment in it? Is it because they want to develop the models that can help them um, produce technological advancements that will advance weaponry? Like, is this a race to the best model that can develop the best, most advanced fighter jets? You know, like jumping from a fifth or sixth generation to a 10th generation. What is the point if it's not very profitable?
Yeah, I think I think the reason is actually much more mundane. The reason is this, because these past 20 years, capital has been monopolized by a few corporations. They have to put their money somewhere to guarantee returns for the investors. AI is what sells. It's the hype. Okay, so maybe in 5 years' time, this entire industry goes bust because it's not profitable, but that's 5 years away. Okay, so we've reached really the end stage of capitalism, right? It's monopoly capitalism where a few people have control all the money, and the money has to go somewhere. So it goes into like these big projects that cost trillions of dollars with the hope that it will transform society and remake the economy. But if it doesn't, it's not their problem. It's investors' problem. Like that's the world we're living in now. There's just absolutely no place to put all this money that guarantees the return that investors want, because so much capital has been consolidated into so few hands.
If I can pivot for this one last question, if we can go back to the Iran war, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, those are two big questions. I'll try to summarize it or simplify it. In your view, what do the next 5 years look like? So, does China go for Taiwan? Uh, do they try to invade Iran in the next couple of years? Does the Russia-Ukraine war come to a pause, or does Russia, take Odessa in the next few years?
Okay, so if China invades Taiwan, then everything I believe about the world is completely wrong. Okay, you should just treat me as an idiot. Okay, because I do not believe under any circumstances China will invade Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party is first and foremost concerned about regime stability. The Chinese economy is going through very hard times, and there's no optimistic outlook. So the
Can
idea
you
that
elaborate on why? Because for the rest of us outside, we see all these videos of China looking amazing, LED buildings.
yeah,
Why are you describing the Chinese economy as going through a hard time?
okay. So you look at YouTube videos, okay? Obviously, you see all these skyscrapers and futuristic cities and high-speed rail and self-driving cars and robots. It's all very impressive, okay? But let me tell you how the Chinese economy works. And I'm going to take some time, okay? But like once you understand this story, this joke, then you understand how the Chinese economy works. And the story goes like this. So um, let's go back to 2000, early 2000s, and Beijing has won the bid to host the Summer Olympics. Okay, now the Beijing government is needs to build up all these new skyscrapers to host the Olympics. So it's taking bids, and three companies approach the Beijing government. Okay, the first company is the Singaporean government, and they say we want $1 billion to build the stadium, and that's a really good deal. The Americans say we want $2 billion because we use the best materials, we have the best technology. But then the third company is a local Beijing company, and they say we want $3 billion. And the Beijing government is shocked. Like, how do you justify this bid? Because the Singaporeans want 1 billion, the Americans want 2 billion, and you want 3 billion. And then the local Beijing company said, it's very simple math. Okay, here's the math: 1 billion for you, 1 billion for me, and 1 billion for the Singaporeans to go build that stadium. So that's the basis for the entire Chinese economy. That's why you see all these skyscrapers being built in China, because it gives the corrupt officials a pretext to steal from the nation. Everyone sees the skyscrapers. No one sees the debt behind the skyscrapers. Uh, like just look at any Chinese bank. Their balance sheets are off the wall. The amount of debt that each bank has is just crazy.
And who are they borrowing from? The central government, the IMF? Who are they borrowing from?
Oh, yeah. So they're borrowing from the future, right? They're borrowing from the nation, so that they can take this money, put it overseas for the Belt and Road Initiative, and then live very nice lives in the West. Okay, so it's the Chinese people that they're stealing from. It's the future that they're stealing from.
And so, what is the logic in your view for doing this other than short term corruption or greed? Is it if we just show GDP, we can attract foreign investment?
So the logic is regime stability. Okay, so in Chinese history, the way you maintain regime stability is by co-opting local elites, by making sure local elites are happy with the way things are. Because obviously the people are not a challenge to your authority; it's the local elites that could rebel against you. So by creating the system in which local elites have many ways to be corrupt, it basically appeases them. Okay, so that's the idea of regime stability. So corruption is not a bug of the system; it's a feature of the system. It's the entire point of the system. So by nationalizing corruption, it allows for regime stability. Okay, that's the first point. Second point is people are generally impressed by these skyscrapers, right? So the people are like feel confident. They're like, like China has arisen, China has stood up. We're so powerful. So there are lots of political benefits in building up these skyscrapers. But again, the long term costs to the environment, to the financial system, to the economy. I mean, it'll be devastating for China. So China cannot afford to fight a war.
Okay, so for that reason, you're saying that there's no way that China would risk, you know, putting pressure on this fragile system to go to war with Taiwan, even though they're rapidly building up their military strength. Is that a bluff in your view?
I mean, like ultimately, those skyscrapers are meant to impress the people of China and the world. The Chinese military is also meant to impress the people of China and the world. And also, I mean, like, if you're China, why would you go to war when you just bribe Taiwanese politicians? I mean, like that's just the Chinese system, right? Of geopolitics. We won't go to war with you, but we'll bribe your local elite in order to appropriate your resources. That's the entire mentality of the Belt and Road Initiative. So Chinese don't go to war. I mean, if you just look at, like, historically speaking, um, Chinese have initiated very few wars. Most wars have been defensive.
So, in your view, then China won't invade Taiwan. What about the situation in Russia and in Iran? What do you think happens next?
Well, as I said in my videos, I don't think Southeast Asia matters, but I mean, like Anatolia, the Middle East, it's World War III, and so the sequencing of events that I see is, and I could get the sequencing wrong, okay, but I see these events happening. So I do believe that the United States and Iran, the conflict will escalate. And it's possible that Israel is the one driving this escalation. But eventually, what will happen is Iran will close off the Strait of Hormuz. Eventually, the Americans will send in ground troops to occupy the Strait of Hormuz and attempt regime change. Eventually, Russia will attempt to take Odessa. Eventually, NATO will militarize and send in troops to defend Odessa. It'll be NATO's last stand. This will cause political upheaval, civil wars in Europe. Um, that's what I see happening. And again, it's all interrelated because these eschatologies believe that there will be a reconciliation between the Orthodox world, led by Putin, and the Islamic world. And one thing that you mentioned in your videos, and I think like this will surprise everyone, is they will destroy the Al Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. It will happen, and it's going to shock everyone because it's like, why would you do this? And if you look at things purely from a geopolitical, economic, materialistic perspective, you won't understand why. And that's why I've been focusing so much on eschatology, because eschatology helps you understand why this will happen. Okay, so again, look, I'm making these predictions, and I would be perfectly happy if none of these predictions happen, because I have 3 kids and I want them to grow up in a safe world. I mean, like, I don't want wars, and I'll be perfectly happy to come back on your show if none of these things happen and say I'm an idiot, and no one should ever take anything I say. Like just don't believe anything I say anymore, because my entire understanding of history, geopolitics is wrong. But if I am correct, then I've given you a model, an analytical model to understand why things are happening, and hopefully we can together better shape the course of events that will unfold.
Okay, how?
Excuse me.
How?
Okay. um, so if my analytical model is correct, then the world is headed towards war, chaos, collapse. And in order for us to rebuild the world, first of all, we have to imagine a better world. What would a better world look like? And I think a world in which we recognize our humanity, when we ignore these religious, racial divisions, and just say that we're all human and we all share a similar history. And that's the first step. Second step is, listen, we now have these tools, predictive history, game theory, that allow us to better shape the world around us. So let's make sure that we're aware of these tools. Let's make sure our kids are learning these tools so that we can build a better world. And the third thing, I think this is the most important, is let's tell the truth. All right, let's tell the truth about what's happening. Let's tell the truth about what will happen. Let's not gaslight other people. Let's not hide our heads in the sand. What's happening in Israel, in Gaza, is atrocious. Let's just admit why it's happening. It's happening because of the empire. Okay, it's happening because of the greed, selfishness, materialism of the empire. Let's just admit this. Let's be truthful to ourselves, and let's just be truthful to our children. And that's the least we can do for our children.
Very well said. I want. I'm sorry to take up so much more of your time. I want to ask one last question, if I can.
Sure.
So it just came to me, while you were describing the greed or the corruption embedded in the system of the CCP in China. China is atheist, as you describe it, but is there a way in which the communist fight against capitalism, late stage capitalism, trying to bring about this end of this system of capitalism, which could be, a metaphorical end of times or end of the world type event, can that form an eschatological or form of religious belief? The idea that we need to create a more communist vision for the world.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're right in that in communism there's embedded in eschatology, and Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution, he was the one who tried to bring about this eschatology. And right now, I mean, no one talks about the Cultural Revolution. People consider the Cultural Revolution to be the worst possible fate for China. So there's this negation of the communist eschatology. There's also a negation of communism. And what's left is none of the religion, none of the aspirations, none of the hope, the faith. What's left is pure materialism. And the idea is that, hey, if you're making money and you're buying stuff, you should be happy. Stop complaining.
Very interesting. All right, Professor Jiang, thank you so much for spending time with us today. It was a pleasure. We hope we can have you back on soon.
Yeah.
If you could quickly just share with our audience, obviously, I'm going to list your YouTube channel. They can see it here on the screen now, and they'll be able to subscribe. But is there any other way that they can follow your work or support your work even?
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. You know, you have a wonderful mind. I mean, it's very broad. It's very deep. So I really enjoy this conversation. So I would love to come back whenever you wanna uh, have me. So if you want to follow my work, you know, best place is my YouTube channel where I'm posting my videos. Um, my Twitter account, and hopefully you can see in the description, is at Xueqin. I'm on X Twitter, and I post there a lot. So these are the two places where you can basically contact me. And I love engaging with my audience. So please feel free to reach out.
And I think you mentioned that you're going to be creating like a whole course or curriculum. Is it going to be like a digital university that people can subscribe to, or is it just they watch your videos in sequence?
Right. So this YouTube thing, it's new. And I really didn't expect this to happen. Like literally what happened was on June 14th, I got on a plane to take my kids back to Toronto, Canada to see the grandparents. And then when I got off the plane, I was famous. And so I was not prepared for how enthusiastic the response has been to my YouTube video. But my full-time job is as an educator. I teach. I teach high school students in China, and what I do is I upload the courses to YouTube. So in the fall semester, I'll be teaching a course on secret history of the world. So I'll be talking about the convergence of intelligence and religion, and how this nexus shapes world history. So I'll be going through the entire history of humanity through that lens. So it'll be a really fun course. It'll be new. So definitely check it out. And then in the spring, I'll be teaching two new courses. One is on the great books, where I'll be introducing to a general audience all the great classical works of human literature, and I'll be teaching game theory analysis so that you can learn how to see the world, how to think like I do, and hopefully that will help you better understand the world. So these are three new courses that are coming up. They'll all be on YouTube. It's all free. You can subscribe and enjoy for free. But in the future, I do hope to sub some internet courses for a more mature, more sophisticated audience. So, but that's in the future.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you again, Professor. We'll definitely have you back on soon.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay.
Trust nothing. No